Hi, I'm Sophia, and if you've ever poured your soul into something only to watch someone you trusted steal it and call you crazy for thinking it was yours, then you'll understand every word of what I'm about to tell you. My sister didn't just take my revolutionary app idea that could have changed mental health care forever. She convinced our entire family I was having delusions of grandeur, launched my platform under her company name, and told every investor in Silicon Valley that I was nothing more than a junior developer she'd hired to help with basic coding. But here's what she didn't know. While she was busy playing CEO with my dreams, I had already filed 3 separate patent applications that would prove ownership beyond any shadow of doubt. The approval letters arrived the week she was celebrating her Series A funding round. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sophia Rivera, and until 18 months ago, I believed that family meant protection, that sisterhood meant loyalty, and that hard work would always speak for itself. I was 26, living in a cramped studio apartment in Palo Alto, surviving on instant ramen and the kind of desperate hope that keeps you coding until 4 in the morning. I had spent 3 years developing what I knew would revolutionize how people access mental health support. The app wasn't just another meditation tracker or mood journal. It was an adaptive AI system that could detect emotional patterns through voice analysis and text input, then provide personalized therapeutic interventions in real time. I called it EmotiLink. The idea came to me during my darkest period. After graduating from Stanford with a computer science degree and drowning in student debt, I had moved back home with my parents in San Jose. The transition from academic success to post-graduation reality hit me like a freight train. I was applying to dozens of tech jobs daily, getting rejection after rejection, and watching my classmates land positions at Google and Facebook while I couldn't even get callbacks from startups. The anxiety was consuming me. I would lie awake at night, my mind racing with thoughts of failure and inadequacy. Traditional therapy was too expensive, and the free counseling resources were booked months in advance. That's when I realized millions of people were trapped in the same cycle. Mental health support was either prohibitively expensive or had impossible wait times. But what if technology could bridge that gap? What if artificial intelligence could provide immediate, personalized emotional support that adapted to each user's specific needs and communication patterns? I started sketching algorithms on napkins during my shifts at a local coffee shop. Every tip I earned went toward server costs for my development environment. Every free moment was spent researching natural language processing and emotional pattern recognition. My sister Carla was 3 years older and had always been the golden child. While I was coding in my bedroom, she was climbing the corporate ladder at a prestigious marketing firm in San Francisco. She had the designer clothes, the downtown apartment, the kind of confidence that makes investors write checks. When family gathered for holidays, conversations revolved around Carla's latest promotion or her networking events with tech executives. I was proud of her success, but I also felt invisible. My parents would ask about my computer projects with the same tone they might use to discuss a hobby like stamp collecting. Everything changed the night I finally showed Carla my prototype. It was Thanksgiving 2022, and we were both staying at our parents' house. After dinner, while everyone watched football in the living room, I pulled out my laptop and nervously demonstrated EmotiLink. The interface was rough, but the core functionality was revolutionary. I could analyze a user's written input for emotional indicators, cross-reference it with voice patterns if they chose to record audio, and provide customized coping strategies that evolved based on effectiveness feedback. Carla's eyes widened as she watched the demo. She asked intelligent questions about user privacy, scalability, monetization potential. For the first time in years, I felt like she truly saw me as an equal, not just her little sister who played with computers. She even suggested we grab coffee the next week to discuss it further. I was floating on air. Finally, someone in my family understood that I wasn't just tinkering around. I was building something that could help millions of people. Over the following months, Carla became my unofficial advisor. She would call me regularly, asking about my progress, offering suggestions about user experience design, even connecting me with a few contacts who might provide feedback. I was grateful for her interest and support. When she suggested I present EmotiLink at a small pitch event she was organizing for women entrepreneurs, I jumped at the chance. I spent weeks preparing my presentation, refining my pitch deck, practicing my delivery, until I could explain the technology clearly and compellingly. The pitch event was held at a trendy co-working space in South Bay. About 30 people attended, mostly other women starting their own businesses. I was nervous but excited. This felt like my moment to step out of the shadows and claim my place in the tech world. My presentation went well. The audience asked thoughtful questions, and several people approached me afterward to exchange contact information. One woman, a venture capitalist named Janet Morales, seemed particularly interested. She handed me her card and said she'd love to schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss investment possibilities. I called Carla immediately after the event, practically vibrating with excitement. She congratulated me and suggested we celebrate with dinner that weekend. During our meal, she peppered me with questions about the venture capitalist meeting, about my business model, about my long-term vision for scaling the platform. I answered everything openly, trusting her completely. She was my sister, my supporter, my biggest advocate. When she offered to help me prepare for the investor meeting, I gratefully accepted. What I didn't realize was that Carla was conducting market research for her own purposes. While I spent the next week refining my business plan and financial projections, she was making her own calls. 3 days before my scheduled meeting with Janet Morales, I received an email that shattered my world. Janet was canceling our meeting. She had decided to invest in a similar mental health platform that had more advanced development and stronger business leadership. The company was called Mindflow, and the founder was someone named Carla Rivera. I stared at that email for 20 minutes, reading it over and over, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Mindflow. Carla Rivera. It couldn't be my Carla. There had to be some mistake, some coincidence. But when I Googled the company name, there it was. A professional website featuring my sister's headshot and a description of an AI-powered mental health platform that sounded exactly like EmotiLink. The technology overview, the target market, even the color scheme I had chosen for my prototype. Everything except my name. My hands were shaking as I called Carla. The phone rang 4 times before she answered, and when she did, her voice sounded strange. Distant. Professional. I struggled to find words. Carla, I just saw something online about a company called Mindflow, and I think there might be some confusion, because it looks exactly like my app, and it has your name on it, and I don't understand what's happening. There was a long pause. Then Carla sighed, and when she spoke again, her tone was completely different. Not warm and supportive like it had been for months. Cold. Businesslike. Sophia, we need to talk, but not over the phone. Can you meet me for lunch tomorrow? I barely slept that night. My mind kept spinning through possibilities, trying to find an explanation that didn't involve the worst-case scenario. Maybe Carla had submitted my idea to help me somehow. Maybe she had misunderstood something about intellectual property. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a simple conversation. I clung to these hopes, even as a growing dread settled in my stomach. The restaurant Carla chose was upscale, the kind of place where tech executives made deals over expensive wine. She was already seated when I arrived, wearing a crisp blazer and looking every inch the successful businesswoman. She stood to hug me, but it felt formal, performative. As soon as we sat down, she launched into what sounded like a prepared speech. Sophia, I want you to know that I value our relationship, and I think there's been some confusion about the nature of our collaboration on this project. Collaboration. The word hit me like a slap. I've been developing Mindflow for over a year now, and while your technical input has been helpful, the core business concept and strategy have always been mine. I think you've gotten a little confused about roles and ownership. I felt like I was listening to her speak through water. Nothing she was saying made sense. Carla, that's my app. That's EmotiLink. I showed it to you, I built it, I've been working on it for 3 years. She shook her head with what looked like genuine sympathy. Sophia, I know you've been struggling since graduation. I know you want to be successful in tech. But you can't just claim ownership of ideas that don't belong to you. It's not healthy. Not healthy. She was treating me like I was delusional, like I was having some kind of breakdown. I have all the code, I said desperately. I have documentation, I have timelines, I can prove everything. Carla reached across the table and patted my hand condescendingly. Honey, writing code isn't the same as founding a company. I've secured funding, I've built a team, I've established partnerships. You helped with some technical development, and I'm grateful for that. But MindFlow is my vision, my business. The conversation continued for another hour, but it felt like speaking two different languages. Every piece of evidence I presented, she dismissed. Every timeline I referenced, she reinterpreted. By the time we left the restaurant, she had painted a complete picture in which I was a junior developer who had helped with her project, but had somehow convinced myself I was the original creator. She even suggested I might benefit from talking to a therapist about distinguishing between reality and wishful thinking. I drove home in a daze, questioning everything I thought I knew about my own life. Carla was so confident, so convincing. She had documentation I hadn't seen before, business plans that looked professional and polished. For a brief, horrible moment, I wondered if she was right. Had I somehow imagined my role in creating EmotiLink? Was I so desperate for success that I had constructed an elaborate fantasy? But when I got back to my apartment and opened my laptop, reality came flooding back. There were my original sketch files, dating back 3 years. My code repositories with thousands of commits and detailed progress notes. My research documents, my user testing results, my algorithm iterations. This wasn't wishful thinking or delusion. This was theft, plain and simple. My sister had stolen my life's work and was now gaslighting me into believing I had imagined the whole thing. That night, I called my parents. I needed someone to confirm my version of reality, someone who remembered me talking about EmotiLink long before Carla had ever shown interest. But the conversation didn't go as I hoped. My mother listened patiently as I explained the situation, but when I finished, there was a long pause. Sophia, sweetheart, I think you might be getting confused. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Carla has been talking about her mental health business idea for months. She even showed us some of her plans at Christmas. I remember because your father and I were so impressed with her presentation. I felt the ground shifting beneath me. Mom, I showed you my app too. I've been working on this for years. Another pause. Honey, I know you've been working on computer things, but Carla is the business person in the family. Maybe you two worked on something together, and there's been a misunderstanding about who did what. The call ended with my mother suggesting that Carla and I sit down with a mediator to sort out our partnership issues. She didn't seem to consider the possibility that Carla had done anything wrong. She just assumed there had been some kind of miscommunication between sisters who had collaborated on a project. I realized that Carla hadn't just stolen my idea. She had spent months carefully constructing a narrative in which she was the visionary entrepreneur, and I was, at best, a helpful technical assistant. Over the next few weeks, I watched helplessly as MindFlow gained momentum. Carla appeared on local business podcasts, describing her journey as a female founder in tech. She gave interviews about the challenges of building AI systems for mental health support, using technical language that I recognized from my own research notes. She even launched a blog where she wrote about the inspiration behind her company, describing late nights of coding and breakthrough moments that I knew were mine. The most painful part was watching our extended family celebrate her success. Our cousins shared her podcast appearances on social media. Our aunts and uncles posted proud messages about having an entrepreneur in the family. Family friends congratulated my parents on raising such an innovative daughter. And through it all, I remained invisible. Worse than invisible. I was the sister who couldn't get her act together, who was maybe a little jealous of Carla's success, who might be having some emotional problems that required professional help. I knew I needed legal advice, but I also knew I couldn't afford a good attorney. I had been living paycheck to paycheck, and most of my savings had gone toward developing EmotiLink. I started researching intellectual property law, trying to understand my options. I read about patent applications, copyright protections, trade secret violations. The more I learned, the more I realized how vulnerable I had been. I had been so focused on building the technology that I had neglected to protect it legally. But I also discovered something that gave me hope. I had been documenting everything meticulously without even realizing it. Every code commit had a timestamp. Every research session had generated notes with dates. My university email contained threads going back years, where I had discussed EmotiLink with professors and classmates. I had a digital paper trail that proved the timeline of my work, even if I didn't have formal legal protections in place. The breakthrough came when I remembered Professor Martinez, my artificial intelligence instructor from Stanford. He had been enthusiastic about EmotiLink when I had presented it as my final project. He had even suggested I consider applying for a research patent through the university. I had been too intimidated by the process at the time, but now I wondered if he might still have records of my work. When I called Professor Martinez, he remembered me immediately. More importantly, he remembered EmotiLink. Sophia, I was just thinking about you the other day. I saw an article about a mental health AI startup that sounded remarkably similar to your final project. A company called Mindflow, I think. Do you know them? My heart raced. Professor, that company was founded by my sister, but the technology is based on my work. She's claiming she developed it herself. There was a long pause. That's very concerning. Sophia, I still have your project documentation in my files. You submitted some truly innovative work. If there's been intellectual property theft, you have substantial evidence to support your claim. I'd be happy to provide testimony about the originality and timeline of your research. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't delusional. I had created something valuable, and I had the documentation to prove it. More importantly, I had credible witnesses who could attest to my work. The question now was whether I had the courage to fight for what was mine, even if it meant going to war with my own family. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to file for patents on my core algorithms. I was going to document every piece of evidence I had. And I was going to expose the truth about Mindflow no matter what it cost me personally. My sister thought she could steal my dreams and rewrite history to erase me from the story. She was about to learn that some fights are worth having, even when the battlefield is your own family. The next morning, I started building my case. I had no idea that within 6 months, Carla's world would come crashing down, and mine would finally begin. The evidence was sitting right there in my Gmail inbox, hiding in plain sight like a smoking gun I'd been too devastated to notice. It was 3 weeks after my confrontation with Carla, and I was methodically going through every digital trace of our interactions, trying to build a timeline that would prove my sanity to myself if no one else. I had been searching through months of text messages when I decided to check my email archive for anything related to EmotiLink development. What I found made my hands tremble as I scrolled through the results. There, buried in a thread from 8 months ago, was an email exchange that revealed the calculated nature of Carla's theft. The subject line read, "Quick favor, technical specs?" And the timestamp showed it was sent just 2 days after I had given her the full demonstration of EmotiLink's core functionality. In the email, Carla had written to someone named Marcus Chen, who I later discovered was a venture capitalist she had been courting. She was asking for theoretical feedback on a mental health AI concept she was developing. The email described EmotiLink's algorithm in precise detail, using technical language that I knew for certain Carla didn't understand. She had copied entire paragraphs from my project documentation, including specific terminology about neural language processing and emotional pattern recognition that would have been impossible for her to know without access to my research. But the most damning part was a line near the end where she wrote, "I'm still working out some technical kinks with my development team, but the core innovation is solid." Development team. She was already positioning herself as the leader of a team, with me relegated to anonymous technical support, just days after I had trusted her with my most precious work. The response from Marcus Chen was equally revealing. He had written back expressing enthusiasm about the concept and requesting a formal pitch meeting. He specifically mentioned being impressed by the sophisticated approach to real-time emotional analysis, and suggested she should move quickly to secure intellectual property protections. because the idea had significant commercial potential. The timestamp on his response was 9 months ago, which meant Carla had been pursuing my concept with investors while I was still believing we were having supportive family conversations about my dreams. I screenshot every single email in the thread, my heart pounding as I realized the implications. This wasn't just opportunistic sister rivalry. This was premeditated intellectual property theft. Carla had seen the value in EmotiLink immediately and had begun positioning herself to claim ownership before I even knew I was in a competition. While I was coding late into the night and surviving on instant noodles, she was crafting a business strategy around stealing my life's work. The email trail led me to dig deeper into her digital footprint. I created a fake LinkedIn profile and started investigating the professional network she had been building around MindFlow. What I discovered was a sophisticated web of connections that stretched back months before she had ever shown any interest in my project. She had been connecting with mental health professionals, AI researchers, and startup investors long before our Thanksgiving conversation. Her LinkedIn activity showed she had been liking and commenting on posts about artificial intelligence in healthcare, positioning herself as someone knowledgeable about the intersection of technology and mental wellness. I found posts where she discussed the, quote, challenges of building emotionally intelligent AI systems and shared articles about the future of personalized mental health interventions. The language was eerily similar to conversations we had supposedly been having as sisters, but seeing it displayed publicly made me realize those weren't supportive family discussions. They were research sessions where she was extracting information to build her own credibility in a field she knew nothing about. The most devastating discovery came when I found a cached version of her personal website from 10 months ago. In the About section, she had written about her passion for leveraging technology to democratize mental health care, and described herself as someone who, quote, spent years researching the applications of artificial intelligence in emotional support systems. The timeline made no sense. 10 months ago, I hadn't even told her about EmotiLink yet. She was creating a false history of expertise and interest in my exact field of work, building a foundation for the theft that was still months away. I printed out every piece of evidence and spread it across my tiny kitchen table like a detective building a case. The pattern was undeniable. Carla hadn't stumbled upon my idea and impulsively decided to claim it. She had been systematically positioning herself to steal it from the moment she realized its potential. Every supportive conversation, every offer to help, every suggestion about business strategy had been part of a calculated campaign to extract my intellectual property while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. But the evidence gathering had an unexpected emotional cost. Reading through months of manipulative communications forced me to relive every moment when I had felt grateful for her support, every time I had praised her business acumen, every instance when I had felt lucky to have such an engaged and interested sister. The betrayal wasn't just about the theft of my work. It was about the systematic destruction of my ability to trust my own perceptions and the weaponization of family love against my professional aspirations. I realized that Carla had been studying me as much as she had been studying my technology. She understood exactly which emotional buttons to press to keep me sharing information. When I expressed anxiety about the business side of launching a startup, she positioned herself as the experienced guide who could help navigate those challenges. When I worried about my ability to articulate the technical concepts to non-technical investors, she offered to help me practice my pitches. She had turned my vulnerabilities into access points for her theft. The psychological manipulation was almost more sophisticated than the intellectual property theft itself. She had created a dynamic where questioning her motives felt like paranoia, where protecting my work felt like selfishness, where asserting ownership felt like attacking family bonds. Even now, with documentary evidence of her deception spread across my table, part of me still felt guilty for investigating my own sister. The conditioning to prioritize family harmony over personal protection ran deeper than I had realized. Armed with this evidence, I decided to reach out to Marcus Chen directly. I created a professional email account and sent him a carefully worded message explaining that I was the original developer of the technology he had discussed with Carla Rivera. I attached timestamps showing my work predated her pitch, along with code samples and research documentation that proved my ownership of the core innovations he had found compelling. His response came within hours and confirmed my worst fears about how far Carla's deception had spread. Marcus wrote that he had been concerned about some inconsistencies in Carla's technical explanations during their meetings, and had wondered whether she truly understood the sophisticated algorithms she was describing. He mentioned that when he had asked detailed questions about the implementation, she had deflected by saying she preferred to keep the technical details confidential until after funding was secured. More troubling was his revelation that Carla had explicitly told him she was the sole creator of the technology, and that she had no partners or collaborators involved in the development. She hadn't just stolen my work, she had actively erased me from the narrative to prevent any potential claims to ownership. Marcus also mentioned that Carla had submitted a business plan that claimed she had been working on the concept for over 2 years, which would have predated my actual development timeline by several months. The conversation with Marcus opened doors to other investors who had been approached by Carla. I discovered that she had been shopping EmotiLink technology to multiple venture capital firms, each time presenting herself as the sole innovator and founder. The consistency of her story across different presentations suggested she had rehearsed and refined her theft narrative until it became second nature. She wasn't just stealing from me opportunistically, she was building an entire false professional identity around my work. Meanwhile, my family remained completely convinced by Carla's version of events. My mother called me several times during this period expressing concern about my obsession with trying to undermine my sister's success. She suggested I was experiencing some kind of breakdown related to post-graduation stress, and recommended I seek counseling to help process my feelings of inadequacy compared to Carla's achievements. The most painful conversation was with my father, who had always been proud of my technical abilities but couldn't understand the business implications of what was happening. He listened patiently as I tried to explain intellectual property theft, but I could tell he was interpreting the situation as a personality conflict rather than a legal issue. "Sophia," he said gently, "Carla has always been good at taking ideas and making them successful. Maybe instead of fighting with her, you should think about how you can work together." Work together. The phrase that had become the family's solution to my victimization. No one seemed to consider that working together required honest acknowledgement of who had contributed what. They were asking me to collaborate with someone who had already stolen my most important work and was actively denying my role in creating it. The suggestion felt like being asked to thank a burglar for breaking into my house. The isolation was compounded by the fact that most of my college friends were busy with their own career launches and didn't fully understand the technical or legal complexities of what I was experiencing. When I tried to explain the situation, they offered well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful advice about not letting family drama interfere with professional goals, or focusing on creating new projects instead of fighting over old ones. They couldn't grasp that this wasn't about sibling rivalry or professional jealousy. This was about the systematic theft of years of work and the destruction of my credibility in my chosen field. The evidence I had gathered was compelling, but I needed professional guidance to understand my legal options. I had been researching intellectual property attorneys, but most charged consultation fees that were beyond my current budget. I was working part-time at a tech support center while building my case, barely earning enough to cover rent and basic expenses. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was helping other people solve technology problems for minimum wage, while my sister was raising millions of dollars using technology I had created. The breakthrough came through an unexpected connection. While researching patent law, I had joined several online forums for inventors and entrepreneurs dealing with intellectual property issues. In one of these forums, I posted a general question about documenting prior art when someone else has filed applications based on your work. A user named Jennifer Walsh responded with detailed advice and mentioned she was an IP attorney who occasionally took pro bono cases for inventors who had been victims of theft. Jennifer agreed to review my documentation during a free consultation call. As I walked her through the timeline, the evidence, and the extent of Carla's deception, I could hear her taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. "Sophia, this is one of the clearest cases of intellectual property theft I've encountered. You have documentation, witnesses, and a timeline that proves prior creation. More importantly, you have evidence of deliberate and systematic deception on your sister's part. This isn't a gray area about collaborative development. This is outright theft." Her validation was the first professional confirmation that I wasn't imagining or exaggerating what had happened to me. Jennifer explained that while I hadn't filed formal patent applications before the theft occurred, I had substantial common law protections based on my documented development process. She also pointed out that Carla's false statements to investors about being the sole creator constituted fraud, which opened additional legal avenues beyond intellectual property claims. The combination of theft and fraud meant I had multiple ways to challenge her ownership and seek damages for the harm she had caused to my professional reputation. But Jennifer also warned me about the challenges ahead. Fighting intellectual property theft was expensive and time-consuming, especially when it involved family members who had constructed elaborate false narratives. Carla had been building her deception for months and had resources I didn't have access to. More concerning was the emotional toll of legal action against family, which often resulted in permanent relationship damage regardless of the outcome. Despite these warnings, I knew I couldn't let Carla succeed in erasing me from my own story. The evidence was too clear, the theft too calculated, and the implications too significant for my future career prospects. If I didn't fight this, she would establish legal ownership of my innovations, making it impossible for me to ever work in my own field without being accused of copying her. More than that, allowing her theft to succeed would validate the narrative that I was delusional, unstable, and incapable of creating anything of value. Jennifer agreed to take my case on a contingency basis, meaning she would be paid from any settlement or damages we recovered rather than requiring upfront fees. She warned me that Carla would likely escalate her manipulation tactics once she realized I was pursuing legal action, but she also assured me that the strength of my evidence gave us significant leverage in negotiations. The next phase would involve formal discovery, where we would request all of Carla's communications, business documents, and technical materials related to MindFlow. Jennifer was confident that once we had access to her complete digital footprint, we would find additional evidence of theft and fraud that would make our case even stronger. She also planned to depose the investors and business partners Carla had been working with, many of whom had probably been given false information about the technology's origins. As I prepared to move forward with legal action, I felt a mixture of terror and liberation. Terror, because I was about to declare war on my own family, and everything that had defined my identity as the supportive, conflict-avoiding sister. Liberation, because I was finally going to fight for what was mine instead of accepting everyone else's narrative about what I deserved. The girl who had been too intimidated to apply for patents was about to challenge a sophisticated theft operation in federal court. Carla had built her empire on the assumption that I would never have the courage or resources to fight back. She had calculated that family pressure and financial constraints would keep me silent, while she consolidated her ownership of my work. What she hadn't anticipated was that stealing someone's dreams could transform them from a victim into a warrior. The battle was just beginning, but for the first time since discovering MindFlow, I felt like I had weapons that could match her manipulation and resources that could challenge her deception. The evidence was gathered, the attorney was hired, and the timeline was documented. Now came the hardest part: maintaining my sanity and determination while my sister tried to destroy me before I could expose her. The call came at 9:30 on a Wednesday morning, just as I was reviewing patent application templates that Jennifer had sent me. The number wasn't one I recognized, but something about the timing felt deliberate. When I answered, a cheerful voice introduced herself as Amanda from TechCrunch, saying she was working on a follow-up article about innovative women founders in the Bay Area mental health space. "I'm particularly interested in the story behind MindFlow," she said, and my stomach immediately nodded. Carla Rivera mentioned she has a sister who's been incredibly supportive throughout her entrepreneurial journey. "I'd love to get your perspective on watching your sister build such an impressive company from the ground up." The audacity took my breath away. Carla had given my name to a journalist, positioning me as the proud, supportive sister who had cheered from the sidelines while she built my company. It was manipulation on a level one hadn't thought possible, turning my existence into a prop for her false narrative, while simultaneously creating a public record of my supposed endorsement of her story. I managed to tell Amanda that I wasn't available for comment and hung up, but the damage was already being set in motion. Within hours, my phone was buzzing with texts from family members who had seen Carla's latest interview online. The article portrayed her as a visionary who had overcome significant technical challenges to bring revolutionary mental health technology to market, with particular emphasis on her dedication to helping her struggling sister through difficult times. The piece included a quote that made me physically nauseous. My sister Sophia has been dealing with some personal challenges since graduation, and watching her struggle with anxiety and career uncertainty actually inspired me to focus on accessible mental health solutions. I hope MindFlow can help people like her who might not otherwise have access to the support they need. She had weaponized my mental health struggles, turning my vulnerability into marketing material for the company built on my stolen work. Every moment of anxiety I had shared with her during my job search, every late-night conversation about my fears of failure, every tear I had shed about feeling lost after graduation had been cataloged and repurposed to enhance her founder story. She wasn't just stealing my technology, she was stealing my pain and repackaging it as her inspiration. My mother called within an hour of the article going live, her voice bright with excitement. "Sophia, did you see Carla's interview? It's so beautiful how she talks about wanting to help people like you. She's always been so caring about your struggles. People like me." As if I was some anonymous beneficiary of her charity rather than the person whose work had made her company possible. My mother continued gushing about how proud she was of Carla's success, and how wonderful it was that she was using her platform to raise awareness about mental health challenges. She seemed completely oblivious to the fact that the struggles Carla was describing were private family matters that had now been broadcast to the tech industry as marketing material. "Mom," I said carefully, "don't you think it's strange that Carla is talking publicly about my personal mental health without asking me first?" There was a pause, and when my mother responded, her tone had shifted slightly. "Honey, I think you're being a little sensitive. Carla didn't say anything negative about you. She was actually being very supportive and showing how much she cares about family." Supportive, the word that had become a weapon in my family's vocabulary, used to frame Carla's exploitation as kindness and my objections as ingratitude. I realized that no matter how clearly I explained the violation, my family would always interpret Carla's actions through the lens of her being the successful, responsible daughter, and me being the one who needed help and guidance. The interview triggered an avalanche of secondary coverage that painted an even more detailed picture of Carla's false narrative. A podcast called Women Who Code invited her on to discuss the technical challenges of building emotional AI, and I listened in horror as she described debugging sessions and algorithm optimization using language that could only have come from my development notes. She talked about the breakthrough moment when she solved a particular neural network training problem, describing the exact solution I had discovered after 3 weeks of troubleshooting. The host asked about her technical background, and Carla smoothly explained that she had been self-taught in machine learning, motivated by her passion for mental health applications. She mentioned taking online courses and reading research papers, creating a plausible but entirely fictional education story that positioned her as a dedicated autodidact, rather than someone who had stolen years of someone else's research and development. When the conversation turned to future plans, Carla discussed her vision for expanding MindFlow's capabilities in ways that directly mirrored ideas I had outlined in my personal project roadmap. She talked about integrating biometric data, developing specialized modules for different therapeutic approaches, and creating enterprise versions for healthcare systems. Every single innovation she described was something I had already conceptualized and documented, but hearing her present these ideas as her own future plans felt like watching someone plan to build a house on land they had stolen from you. The most devastating moment came when the host asked about work-life balance and family support. Carla's voice took on that familiar tone of gentle concern that I now recognized as calculated manipulation. "My sister has been going through a really difficult time since college, and it's been challenging to watch her struggle with direction and purpose. I actually hope that seeing MindFlow succeed might inspire her to pursue her own dreams, maybe in a more realistic way that matches her actual skills and capabilities." More realistic. Actual skills and capabilities. She was publicly positioning me as someone whose aspirations exceeded my abilities, someone who needed to scale down my dreams to match my limited talents. The implication was clear. I was the delusional sister who thought she could build something significant, while Carla was the realistic one who had actually achieved success through hard work and practical thinking. The psychological warfare was more sophisticated than anything I had anticipated. Carla wasn't just stealing my work. She was systematically destroying my credibility and self-confidence through public narratives that painted me as unstable, unrealistic, and dependent on her success for inspiration. Every interview and article added another layer to the story of Saint Carla helping her troubled sister, making it increasingly impossible for me to challenge her without appearing to be the jealous, delusional sibling attacking her successful sister. But Carla had made a critical error in her media strategy. By discussing technical details publicly, she had created a record of her claims about the development process that could be verified against actual documentation. When she described the specific challenges of training emotional recognition models, she was inadvertently providing evidence that could be cross-referenced with my development logs. When she mentioned particular research papers that had influenced her approach, she was creating a trail that could be investigated. Jennifer was fascinated by the media coverage when I forwarded her the articles and podcast transcripts. "This is actually helpful for our case," she explained. She's making specific claims about creation timelines and technical innovations that we can disprove with your documentation. The more detailed her public story becomes, the more opportunities we have to demonstrate its falseness. More importantly, Jennifer pointed out that some of Carla's public statements constituted fraud in their own right. By claiming to investors and media that she had developed technology she had actually stolen, she was engaging in wire fraud and securities fraud that carried both civil and criminal implications. The podcast interviews and articles weren't just public relations disasters for me, they were evidence of ongoing criminal activity. Jennifer suggested we begin documenting every public statement Carla made about MindFlow's development, creating a database of claims that could be systematically refuted with my prior documentation. She also recommended that I avoid making any public statements about the situation until we were ready to file our lawsuit, as anything I said could potentially be used against me if Carla's legal team tried to paint me as unstable or vindictive. The silence was harder than I had expected. Watching lie after lie accumulate in the public record while being unable to defend myself felt like being buried alive in someone else's story. Friends and former classmates sent me links to Carla's interviews with congratulatory messages about how amazing it must be to have such a successful sister, not realizing they were celebrating the theft of my life's work. LinkedIn became a particular source of torment, as people in my professional network shared Carla's content and praised her innovations. Former professors posted about being proud of Stanford alumni like Carla who were making meaningful contributions to technology and society. Classmates commented on her posts with admiration for her technical expertise and business acumen, using the exact same language they might have used to describe my work if they had known the truth. The most painful moment came when Dr. Martinez, my former AI professor who had offered to testify on my behalf, shared one of Carla's interviews with a comment about being inspired by young women who were pushing the boundaries of machine learning applications. He had no idea that the work he was praising was actually mine, stolen and rebranded by someone who couldn't code a basic algorithm without help. I screenshot his post before I could stop myself, staring at the cruel irony of my greatest professional supporter unknowingly celebrating my victimization. The image became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the situation. Good people with good intentions were being manipulated into validating theft because the thief had constructed such a convincing false narrative. The emotional toll of maintaining silence while watching Carla's victory lap extend for weeks was almost unbearable. I found myself checking her social media obsessively, documenting each new lie while feeling increasingly disconnected from reality. The girl who had built EmotiLink in her bedroom was disappearing, replaced by the troubled sister who existed only as a supporting character in Carla's success story. My therapist, Dr. Reynolds, helped me understand that what I was experiencing was a form of psychological abuse called gaslighting on a public scale. Carla wasn't just trying to make me doubt my own perceptions. She was creating a public record that supported her version of reality while systematically erasing mine. The goal wasn't just to steal my work, but to make it impossible for me to ever credibly claim ownership of it. Dr. Reynolds also helped me recognize that my family's response was enabling the abuse, even if they didn't understand what they were doing. By consistently prioritizing family harmony over truth, they were sending the message that my victimization was less important than avoiding conflict with Carla. Their refusal to investigate my claims or even consider the possibility that Carla might be lying was a form of complicity that extended the harm beyond the original theft. But therapy also gave me tools for maintaining my sanity while building my legal case. Dr. Reynolds helped me understand that my worth wasn't determined by my family's recognition or the public's perception of my achievements. The technology I had created was still mine, regardless of who was currently claiming credit for it. The skills I had developed were still real, regardless of who was benefiting from them. The truth was still the truth, even when it was being systematically obscured by sophisticated lies. Armed with this psychological foundation, I began to see Carla's media blitz differently. Instead of proof of her success, I started viewing it as evidence of her desperation. She wasn't just celebrating her victory, she was working overtime to prevent any investigation of her claims. The more elaborate her public story became, the more she had to lose if the truth ever came out. Jennifer confirmed this interpretation when she showed me how Carla's public statements were creating legal vulnerabilities. Every interview was another opportunity for her to make claims that could be disproven. Every article was another piece of evidence that she was engaged in ongoing fraud. Every podcast appearance was another step toward the day when her house of lies would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. "She's building a very impressive prison for herself," Jennifer observed. "The more successful MindFlow becomes based on stolen technology, the greater the damages we can claim. The more public her false narrative becomes, the more spectacular her downfall will be when we expose the truth." The conversation gave me a new perspective on the waiting period before we filed our lawsuit. Instead of feeling helpless while Carla accumulated victories built on my work, I began to see each success as increasing the eventual price she would pay for her theft. Every dollar of investment she raised based on stolen technology was a dollar she would have to pay back. Every public statement about her innovations was evidence that would support our fraud claims. But the most empowering realization was that Carla's success was entirely dependent on maintaining her lies. She had built an identity and a company on stolen foundations, which meant she was living in constant fear of discovery. Every interview was a performance she had to nail perfectly. Every investor meeting was a test of her ability to fake expertise she didn't possess. Every technical question was a threat to expose her fundamental lack of understanding about her own supposed innovations. I, on the other hand, was building my case on truth. My documentation was real. My timeline was accurate. My technical expertise was genuine. While Carla was performing a role that required constant vigilance and perfect execution, I was simply organizing evidence that already existed. The truth was on my side, and eventually, the truth would win. As I prepared for the next phase of our legal strategy, I felt a shift in my relationship with the situation. I was no longer the victim of my sister's theft, helplessly watching her success from the sidelines. I was the plaintiff in a case that would expose sophisticated intellectual property fraud and recover what had been stolen from me. The girl who had been too intimidated to file patents was becoming the woman who would hold thieves accountable in federal court. Carla had made the mistake of believing that family relationships would protect her from legal consequences, that my love for her would prevent me from pursuing justice, that my fear of conflict would keep me silent while she destroyed my future. She was about to discover that some lines, once crossed, transform love into determination and silence into the gathering storm that precedes justice. The discovery happened on a Tuesday afternoon, when I was least expecting it. I had been systematically going through my cloud storage, organizing documentation for Jennifer's review, when I stumbled across a folder I had completely forgotten about. It was labeled Backup Sync Autosave and contained hundreds of automatically saved versions of my work going back 3 years. But what made my pulse race wasn't just the existence of this comprehensive timeline of my development process. It was what I found when I opened the most recent files. Somehow, my automatic backup system had been syncing with a shared drive that I didn't remember creating. As I dug deeper into the folder structure, I realized that Carla had gained access to my entire development repository months ago. Not just the presentations I had willingly shared with her, but every iteration of my code, every research note, every algorithm modification, every user interface sketch. She had been monitoring my progress in real time, downloading my innovations as I created them. The timestamps told a chilling story. Carla had accessed my most sensitive development files just hours after I created them, sometimes downloading entire folders while I was still actively working on them. She hadn't just stolen my finished product. She had been conducting surveillance on my creative process, harvesting my intellectual property as I generated it. The scope of the theft was far more extensive than I had imagined. But the most damaging discovery came when I found evidence that Carla had been sharing my files with others. The access logs showed that multiple IP addresses had downloaded my work through her account, including addresses registered to venture capital firms and technology consulting companies. She hadn't just stolen my innovations for her own use, she had been distributing them to investors and advisors as part of her funding strategy, potentially exposing my intellectual property to dozens of people who believed they were seeing her original work. Among the downloaded files was a document that made my hands shake as I read it. It was my personal development diary, a detailed record of my thought process, my struggles, my breakthrough moments, and my future plans for EmotiLink. Carla had taken this deeply personal account of my creative journey and apparently used it to construct her own founder story, mining my private reflections for authentic details that would make her false narrative more convincing. The diary entries revealed the extent to which my personal vulnerability had been weaponized against me. I had written about my anxiety attacks during particularly challenging coding sessions, my fears about whether I was smart enough to solve complex technical problems, my excitement when algorithms finally worked as intended. These intimate thoughts about my relationship with my work had been harvested and repurposed to create Carla's media-friendly story about the emotional inspiration behind MindFlow. I found specific diary entries that had been clearly referenced in Carla's interviews. When she talked about late nights questioning whether the technology would ever work, she was describing emotions I had documented during my most difficult debugging sessions. When she mentioned, quote, the overwhelming joy of finally solving a problem that had consumed weeks of work, she was referencing a breakthrough moment I had written about in detail. My private emotional landscape had become the raw material for her public persona. The access logs also revealed that Carla had been downloading my files even after launching MindFlow, suggesting that she was continuing to steal my innovations for ongoing development. She wasn't just building her company on stolen foundations, she was maintaining her technological advantage through continued theft of my current work. Every improvement I made to my algorithms, every enhancement I developed for user experience, every optimization I created for performance, was being harvested and integrated into her competing product. This discovery transformed my understanding of the legal situation. What I had thought was a case of intellectual property theft was actually a case of ongoing cybercrime, systematic corporate espionage, and elaborate fraud that had been continuing for months. Carla hadn't just stolen my work once, she had created a system for continuous theft that violated multiple federal statutes. Jennifer's reaction to this evidence was immediate and intense. She called an emergency meeting for the next day and brought in a cybersecurity expert named David Kim to analyze the technical aspects of what had occurred. David's preliminary assessment was devastating for Carla's legal position. The unauthorized access to my cloud storage constituted computer fraud, the systematic downloading of proprietary files was corporate espionage, and the distribution of stolen intellectual property to investors was wire fraud on a massive scale. This isn't just intellectual property theft anymore, Jennifer explained. This is a federal cybercrime investigation waiting to happen. The evidence you've uncovered shows a pattern of deliberate, systematic criminal activity that continued over months. David's technical analysis revealed additional disturbing details about the scope of Carla's surveillance. She had somehow gained access to my development environment credentials, allowing her to monitor not just my finished work, but my active coding sessions. She could see what problems I was working on, what solutions I was testing, what approaches I was abandoning. She had been essentially looking over my shoulder while I worked, stealing my intellectual property in real time. The investigation also revealed that Carla had been using sophisticated tools to automate the theft process. She hadn't been manually downloading my files. She had set up scripts that automatically copied any new or modified documents to her own storage systems. This level of technical sophistication suggested that she had either developed significant hacking skills herself or had hired someone to help her conduct the surveillance operation. But perhaps most importantly, David discovered that Carla had been sloppy about covering her tracks. The automated systems she used to steal my work had created extensive logs that documented every file accessed, every download completed, every distribution to third parties. She had essentially created a complete record of her own criminal activity, stored in systems that could be subpoenaed as evidence. She built a perfect case against herself, David observed. Every crime is documented with timestamps, file hashes, and network traces. This is the kind of evidence that makes prosecutors very happy. Jennifer immediately began preparing a criminal referral to the FBI's cybercrime division, while simultaneously expanding our civil lawsuit to include federal racketeering charges. The discovery of systematic theft elevated the case from an intellectual property dispute to a criminal enterprise investigation that could result in both prison time and massive financial penalties for Carla. But the personal impact of understanding the full scope of Carla's betrayal was almost overwhelming. This wasn't the impulsive theft of a sister who had seen an opportunity and taken it. This was a calculated, sophisticated, ongoing criminal operation that had been monitoring and harvesting my creative output for months. Every conversation we had shared about my work, every moment when I had felt grateful for her support, every time I had praised her business insights, had been part of an elaborate performance designed to keep me creating content for her to steal. The psychological manipulation was even more extensive than I had realized. Carla hadn't just been encouraging me to share my work with her. She had been actively managing my productivity to maximize the value of what she could steal. When she suggested I focus on particular features or explore specific technical approaches, she had been directing my development efforts toward innovations that would be most valuable for her own company. I realized that some of my biggest breakthrough moments had come after conversations with Carla, where she had asked seemingly innocent questions about technical challenges I was facing. She hadn't been offering sisterly support. She had been conducting technical reconnaissance, identifying problems that needed solving, and then harvesting my solutions as soon as I developed them. The discovery also explained some puzzling aspects of MindFlow's development timeline. Carla had been able to bring a sophisticated AI platform to market remarkably quickly for someone who supposedly had limited technical background. Now I understood that her rapid development wasn't due to exceptional talent or innovative thinking. It was because she had been building on stolen foundations and continuing to steal improvements as I created them. Armed with this new evidence, Jennifer and I developed a comprehensive legal strategy that would expose not just the original theft, but the ongoing criminal enterprise that Carla had built around stealing my work. We would be filing both civil and criminal complaints that could result in prison time, massive financial penalties, and complete destruction of MindFlow as a business entity. But the most satisfying aspect of our new legal position was that Carla's own sophisticated theft operation had created the evidence needed to destroy her. Every automated download, every file distribution, every access to my development environment had been logged and documented by the very systems she had used to commit her crimes. She had been so focused on stealing efficiently that she had never considered how her theft tools would serve as evidence against her. The irony wasn't lost on me that someone who had built her success on stealing technology had been undone by her own technology. The scripts and monitoring systems that had made her theft operation possible had also created an unimpeachable record of her criminal activity. She had essentially recorded her own confession in the form of technical logs that would be impossible to dispute or explain away. As we prepared to file our expanded lawsuit, I felt a profound shift in my relationship with the entire situation. I was no longer just seeking to recover what had been stolen from me. I was exposing a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had violated multiple federal laws. The girl who had been too intimidated to protect her intellectual property was about to become the woman who brought down a systematic theft operation. The case we were building would serve as a landmark example of cybercrime prosecution in the startup ecosystem, demonstrating that intellectual property theft had serious legal consequences, regardless of family relationships or business success. Carla's assumption that she could steal with impunity because I was her sister was about to be tested in federal court. But more than legal vindication, the discovery gave me something I hadn't had since the nightmare began: absolute certainty about what had happened to me. There was no longer any room for doubt, no possibility that I had misunderstood the situation, No chance that family members could convince me I was imagining things. The technical evidence was clear, comprehensive, and irrefutable. Carla had committed sophisticated crimes against me, and I had the documentation to prove it. The preparation phase took several more weeks as Jennifer assembled expert witnesses, organized the massive amount of evidence we had gathered, and coordinated with federal prosecutors who were interested in pursuing criminal charges. During this time, I maintained complete silence about what we had discovered, even as Carla continued her media victory lap and my family continued pressuring me to reconcile with her. The most difficult part of waiting was watching Carla announce new MindFlow features that I recognized as improvements stolen from my recent work. She held press conferences to unveil innovations that I had developed just weeks earlier, describing them as breakthrough achievements that demonstrated her company's technological leadership. Each announcement was like watching someone take credit for my children, but I knew that every false claim was creating additional evidence for our case. My parents called regularly during this period, expressing increasing concern about my obsession with challenging Carla's success. They had begun suggesting that I seek more intensive therapy to address what they saw as my inability to cope with my sister's achievements. The irony of being told I needed mental health treatment while watching someone steal my mental health technology was almost too absurd to process. But their pressure to drop my investigation only strengthened my resolve to see the case through to completion. They were asking me to accept a version of reality where systematic theft was reframed as family collaboration, where criminal behavior was dismissed as sibling rivalry, where my victimization was treated as a character flaw that needed correction. Their inability to consider that Carla might be lying was enabling her crimes and extending my suffering. Dr. Reynolds helped me understand that my family's response was a form of institutional gaslighting that often occurs when someone challenges a successful manipulator. Carla had constructed such a compelling false narrative that questioning it required confronting the possibility that they had been completely deceived by someone they trusted. It was psychologically easier for them to believe that I was having problems than to accept that they had been supporting a criminal. But the therapeutic work also prepared me for the possibility that exposing Carla's crimes might permanently destroy my relationships with family members who had invested heavily in believing her story. Some people, when confronted with evidence that contradicts their fundamental assumptions, choose to reject the evidence rather than revise their beliefs. I had to be prepared for the possibility that proving my case might cost me my family. The decision to proceed despite this risk wasn't difficult. Allowing Carla's theft to succeed would mean accepting a future where she controlled my innovations, my professional reputation, and my ability to work in my chosen field. It would mean validating the narrative that I was delusional, unstable, and incapable of creating anything of value. It would mean letting sophisticated crimes go unpunished and encouraging other thieves who might target vulnerable inventors. More importantly, I had discovered something about myself during the investigation that changed how I understood my own capabilities. The girl who had been too intimidated to file patents had successfully uncovered and documented a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The sister who had always avoided family conflict was preparing to challenge that family in federal court. The developer who had thought she needed other people's validation to succeed had built a case that would vindicate her work, regardless of what anyone else believed. When Jennifer called to tell me that the FBI had agreed to open a criminal investigation based on our evidence, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. Carla's sophisticated theft operation was about to face the full weight of federal law enforcement, and her house of lies was finally going to collapse under scrutiny from investigators who couldn't be manipulated by family dynamics or false narratives. The timing was perfect. Carla had just announced MindFlow's Series B funding round, valuing her stolen company at $50 million. She was scheduled to keynote a major technology conference the following week, where she would be celebrated as an innovative young entrepreneur changing the mental health landscape. Her success was at its peak, making her downfall all the more spectacular when the truth finally emerged. As I prepared for the legal battle ahead, I felt grateful for every day I had spent building my case instead of accepting my family's narrative that I should just move on. The evidence we had gathered was irrefutable, the legal strategy was comprehensive, and the consequences for Carla would be severe enough to deter other potential thieves from targeting inventors who seemed vulnerable. But most importantly, I had reclaimed my own story. I was no longer the troubled sister who needed to scale down her dreams to match her limited capabilities. I was the inventor whose breakthrough technology had been stolen by a sophisticated criminal operation, and I was the prosecutor who had uncovered and documented that operation well enough to ensure justice would be served. The battle was far from over, but I had already won the most important victory: the right to tell the truth about what had happened to me, backed by evidence that no one could dispute or explain away. Carla had built her empire on stolen foundations, but I had built my case on truth, and truth has a permanence that stolen success can never match. The next phase would bring public vindication, financial recovery, and legal consequences that would ensure Carla never stole from anyone again. But the real victory was personal. I had refused to let someone else's lies become my reality, even when that someone was my own sister, even when my entire family believed her instead of me. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones where you're fighting not just for what you've lost, but for who you really are underneath all the damage that others have tried to inflict. I had fought that battle and won, regardless of what any court might eventually decide. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity when they read the verdict. 6 months of litigation, 3 weeks of testimony, and countless hours of technical evidence presentation had led to this moment. I sat in the front row beside Jennifer, my hands folded calmly in my lap, watching as Carla's entire world crumbled in real time. The jury foreman stood and delivered the words that would change everything. Guilty on all counts of wire fraud, computer fraud, theft of trade secrets, and racketeering. But the real vindication had come weeks earlier, in a way I never could have anticipated. The FBI investigation that began with my evidence had uncovered something far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Carla hadn't just stolen from me. She had been operating a systematic intellectual property theft ring that targeted multiple inventors and small technology companies. I was one of dozens of victims whose work had been harvested, repackaged, and sold to investors as original innovations. The federal investigation revealed that Carla had been using her legitimate marketing firm as a front for identifying promising technologies that could be stolen. She would approach inventors under the guise of offering business development services, gain access to their intellectual property through, quote, collaboration agreements, and then systematically harvest their innovations for her own ventures or for sale to larger technology companies. The scope of the operation was staggering. Over 4 years, Carla had generated more than $20 million in revenue from stolen intellectual property, affecting hundreds of inventors and multiple startup ecosystems. MindFlow wasn't her first stolen company. It was just the latest and most successful in a long line of ventures built on other people's work. The sophisticated theft tools and surveillance systems I had discovered were infrastructure she had developed to steal from multiple victims simultaneously. Among the evidence seized by the FBI were detailed files on dozens of other inventors, complete with psychological profiles, technical assessments, and strategic plans for approaching and manipulating each target. The files revealed that I had been selected as a victim months before our Thanksgiving conversation, identified through university databases and social media analysis as someone with valuable technology and psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited. My file contained notes about my family dynamics, my financial struggles, my anxiety about career prospects, and my tendency to seek validation from authority figures. Carla had studied me like a predator studies prey, identifying exactly which emotional buttons to press to gain access to my work. The sisterly support that I had been so grateful for was revealed to be a calculated manipulation strategy based on detailed psychological profiling. But the most disturbing discovery was that Carla had been documenting her theft methods and sharing them with other criminals. The FBI found training materials she had created, teaching other fraudsters how to identify vulnerable inventors, how to gain access to their work, and how to construct false narratives that would prevent victims from challenging the theft. She had been running what amounted to a criminal enterprise focused on intellectual property theft. The revelation that I was part of a much larger criminal operation actually provided a strange sense of relief. The theft hadn't happened because I was naive or careless. It had happened because I was targeted by sophisticated criminals who had perfected their methods through years of practice. The psychological manipulation I had experienced wasn't evidence of my weakness. It was evidence of their expertise in exploiting human trust and family relationships. During the criminal trial, I testified for 3 full days about the development of EmotiLink, the timeline of Carla's theft, and the impact her crimes had on my professional and personal life. Standing in that courtroom, describing my work to a jury while presenting irrefutable evidence of its theft, was one of the most empowering experiences of my life. For the first time since discovering MindFlow, I was able to tell my story in a forum where truth mattered more than family dynamics. The prosecution's case was devastating. They presented technical evidence showing the systematic theft of my work, financial records documenting the profits generated from stolen intellectual property, and communications revealing the deliberate nature of the criminal enterprise. They brought in other victims who testified about similar experiences, creating a pattern of behavior that made Carla's guilt undeniable. Carla's defense strategy was predictable but ineffective. Her attorneys tried to argue that all the technology transfers had been collaborative efforts, that the victims had willingly shared their work, and that any misunderstandings were the result of poor communication rather than criminal intent. They painted her as a successful businesswoman who had been unfairly targeted by jealous inventors who couldn't accept their junior role in collaborative projects. But the technical evidence was overwhelming. The unauthorized access logs, the theft automation scripts, the distribution networks for stolen intellectual property, and the systematic documentation of criminal methods created a case that was impossible to dispute. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The sentencing hearing, 3 months later, was equally satisfying. The judge imposed the maximum penalty allowed under federal guidelines: 8 years in prison, $50 million in restitution to victims, and permanent forfeiture of all assets derived from criminal activity. MindFlow was dissolved as a business entity, with all intellectual property rights returned to the original inventors. But the legal victory was only part of my recovery process. The civil lawsuit that ran parallel to the criminal case resulted in additional damages that compensated me not just for the theft of my work, but for the psychological harm caused by the systematic manipulation and the destruction of my professional reputation. The settlement was substantial enough to fund my own legitimate startup and provide financial security for years to come. More importantly, the civil case established legal precedents that would protect other inventors from similar theft schemes. The court ruled that intellectual property theft involving family relationships would be treated with the same severity as theft between strangers, and that psychological manipulation would be considered an aggravating factor in determining damages. The decision sent a clear message to potential thieves that family connections would not provide immunity from legal consequences. The restoration of my professional reputation was perhaps the most gratifying outcome of the entire process. The technology industry, which had celebrated Carla's supposed innovations, quickly pivoted to recognizing me as the true creator of the breakthrough algorithms that had impressed investors and users. The same venture capitalists who had funded MindFlow approached me about launching a legitimate version of my platform. Dr. Martinez, my former professor who had unknowingly praised my stolen work, became one of my strongest advocates in the academic community. He wrote articles about the case for technology journals, emphasizing the importance of protecting student innovations and the need for stronger intellectual property education in computer science programs. His advocacy helped establish new protocols at Stanford for documenting and protecting student research. The media coverage of the case was extensive and uniformly supportive of my position. The same journalists who had interviewed Carla about her supposed innovations wrote follow-up articles exposing the theft and praising my perseverance in pursuing justice. The narrative shifted completely from celebrating her success to examining how sophisticated criminals could manipulate media coverage to legitimize stolen achievements. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from other inventors who had experienced similar theft. I received hundreds of messages from people who had been victimized by intellectual property thieves, many of whom had never reported their cases because they didn't think anyone would believe them. The publicity surrounding my case encouraged dozens of other victims to come forward, leading to additional criminal investigations and prosecutions. My family's response to the legal outcomes was mixed and complicated. My parents, confronted with irrefutable evidence of Carla's criminal activity, were forced to acknowledge that they had been completely deceived. The process of accepting that their successful daughter was actually a sophisticated criminal who had been manipulating them for years was devastating and required extensive family therapy. My mother's apology, when it finally came, was heartfelt but insufficient to repair the damage that had been done to our relationship. She acknowledged that her refusal to investigate my claims had enabled Carla's continued crimes and had caused me additional psychological harm. But she also struggled to fully understand how her actions had contributed to my victimization, often framing her support of Carla as understandable maternal loyalty rather than complicity in criminal activity. My father's response was more direct and more supportive. He had always prided himself on his analytical thinking, and the evidence of Carla's systematic criminal behavior forced him to recognize how thoroughly he had been manipulated. He became one of my strongest supporters during the legal proceedings, attending every hearing and publicly defending my decision to pursue criminal charges against his own daughter. The relationship with my extended family was permanently altered by the revelations about Carla's criminal enterprise. Some relatives remained loyal to her despite the evidence, choosing to believe that she had been unfairly prosecuted or that her crimes were somehow justified by family considerations. Others were horrified to learn that they had been celebrating and supporting criminal activity, and they made efforts to rebuild relationships with me. But the most important outcome of the entire ordeal was personal transformation that extended far beyond legal vindication or financial compensation. The process of investigating Carla's crimes, building a federal case, and testifying in court had revealed capabilities and strengths that I hadn't known I possessed. The timid graduate who had been too intimidated to file patents had become a confident entrepreneur who understood her own worth and was willing to fight for her rights. The legitimate version of EmotiLink that I launched after the criminal trial was far more sophisticated than anything Carla had stolen. Having access to my complete research archives and the freedom to innovate without theft concerns allowed me to develop features that surpassed the stolen version in every meaningful way. The platform attracted users who had been disappointed by MindFlow's limitations and investors who wanted to support genuine innovation rather than stolen technology. Within 18 months of Carla's conviction, my company had secured Series A funding that valued the legitimate EmotiLink platform at $75 million. Substantially more than MindFlow had achieved at its peak. The irony wasn't lost on me that honest development and authentic innovation had proven more valuable than sophisticated theft and criminal manipulation. But success wasn't just measured in financial terms. The technology I had originally developed to address my own mental health struggles was now helping thousands of users access therapeutic support in ways that would have been impossible without my breakthrough algorithms. The personal pain that had inspired my original research had been transformed into professional accomplishment that was creating real value for people who needed help. The speaking engagements and conference presentations that followed my legal victory provided platforms to advocate for stronger intellectual property protections and better support systems for inventors who had been victimized by theft. I became a recognized expert on technology crime prevention, working with law enforcement agencies and industry organizations to develop tools for identifying and prosecuting sophisticated intellectual property theft. The most rewarding aspect of this advocacy work was mentoring other inventors who had experienced similar crimes. Many victims of intellectual property theft struggle with self-doubt and social isolation, wondering whether they imagined the extent of what was done to them. Being able to provide validation, resources, and practical guidance for pursuing justice helped other innovators reclaim their work and their confidence. Dr. Reynolds, the therapist who had helped me maintain my sanity during the darkest period of Carla's manipulation, often observed that trauma could be transformed into purpose when survivors found ways to help others facing similar challenges. My experience as a victim of sophisticated criminal manipulation had equipped me with unique insights that could benefit other people dealing with family-based fraud and intellectual property theft. The psychological healing process took longer than the legal proceedings, but it was equally important for my long-term recovery. Learning to trust my own perceptions after months of systematic gaslighting required extensive therapeutic work and careful attention to my emotional responses. But the process also revealed resilience and analytical capabilities that had been strengthened by surviving sophisticated manipulation. The relationship with my immediate family gradually improved as we worked through the implications of Carla's crimes and the ways that family dynamics had enabled her criminal behavior. My parents eventually acknowledged that their preference for avoiding conflict had created an environment where Carla's manipulation could flourish unchallenged. They committed to family therapy focused on developing healthier communication patterns and better support systems for addressing difficult truths. But some relationships were permanently changed by the revelations about Carla's criminal activities. Extended family members who had invested heavily in celebrating her success found it difficult to adjust to the reality that they had been supporting criminal enterprise. Some chose to maintain minimal contact rather than fully confronting their role in validating theft and manipulation. The most unexpected outcome of the entire experience was the development of genuine friendships with other inventors and entrepreneurs who had faced similar challenges. The technology community, when functioning properly, is remarkably supportive of people who have been victimized by theft or fraud. The relationships I built with other survivors of intellectual property crime became some of the most valuable and authentic connections in my professional life. 5 years after Carla's conviction, I received notification that she was eligible for parole consideration. The prospect of her potential release triggered some anxiety, but it also provided an opportunity to reflect on how completely my life had been transformed by the experience of surviving and overcoming her crimes. The person who had been devastated by discovering MindFlow was no longer recognizable in the confident entrepreneur who had built a successful company and become an advocate for intellectual property protection. The parole hearing itself was brief and formal. Carla had served her minimum sentence and had participated in recommended rehabilitation programs, making her eligible for supervised release. I chose not to attend the hearing or provide victim impact testimony, having already said everything I needed to say during the original trial. My focus was on continued innovation and growth, rather than on monitoring the consequences faced by someone who had chosen to build her life on criminal activity. When asked by reporters about my thoughts on Carla's potential parole, I simply stated that the justice system had functioned as designed, that appropriate consequences had been imposed for serious crimes, and that my attention was focused on legitimate business development rather than on the actions of convicted criminals. The statement reflected a psychological distance from the trauma that would have been impossible during the darkest period of her manipulation campaign. The technology platform that emerged from my original EmotiLink research continued to evolve and improve, incorporating advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning that weren't available during the initial development period. The legitimate version of the platform was helping tens of thousands of users access personalized mental health support, fulfilling the original vision that had inspired my research and development efforts. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of recovery was the restoration of my relationship with innovation itself. The joy of solving complex technical problems, the satisfaction of creating something useful for people who needed help, and the excitement of pushing the boundaries of what technology could accomplish had all been temporarily destroyed by Carla's theft and manipulation. Reclaiming that passion for authentic innovation was more valuable than any financial settlement or legal victory. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Carla's greatest error hadn't been underestimating the strength of my evidence or the sophistication of my legal team. Her greatest error had been underestimating my determination to fight for what was mine, regardless of family pressure, financial constraints, or psychological manipulation. She had assumed that love and loyalty would prevent me from pursuing justice, but she had discovered that some violations transform love into determination and loyalty, into the resolve to protect others from similar harm. The story that began with discovering my stolen work on TechCrunch had evolved into a comprehensive victory that extended far beyond personal vindication. The criminal prosecution had disrupted an entire network of intellectual property thieves. The civil litigation had established protective precedents for other inventors. The media coverage had raised awareness about sophisticated theft schemes. And the legitimate business success had demonstrated that authentic innovation was more powerful than criminal manipulation. Today, when young inventors ask me for advice about protecting their intellectual property, I tell them that documentation is essential. Legal protections are important, but the most crucial element is the willingness to fight for what belongs to them. Technology theft is a serious crime with serious consequences, but only if victims are willing to pursue justice regardless of personal relationships or social pressure. The girl who had been too intimidated to file patents had become the woman who brought down a criminal enterprise. The sister who had trusted too easily had become the entrepreneur who verified everything. The victim who had questioned her own sanity had become the advocate who helped others reclaim their stolen work. Sometimes the most important victories aren't about getting back what was taken from you. Sometimes they're about becoming someone who can ensure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else. The battle against Carla's criminal enterprise had transformed me into exactly that kind of person, and that transformation was worth more than any technology or business success. The phone call that changed everything came on a rainy Thursday morning, exactly 3 years after Carla's sentencing. I was in my corner office at Sophia Technologies, reviewing quarterly metrics for our mental health platform, when my assistant knocked and said there was an urgent call from the Department of Justice. My stomach immediately tightened, wondering if something had gone wrong with Carla's incarceration, or if new evidence had emerged that would require additional testimony. But the voice on the other end belonged to Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Morrison, who had prosecuted Carla's case, and her tone was excited rather than concerned. "Sophia, I'm calling with extraordinary news. The intellectual property theft ring we uncovered through your sister's case has led to the largest technology crime prosecution in federal history. We've just secured convictions against 43 defendants across 7 states, and the total recovery for victims is approaching $200 million. The scope of what they had discovered was staggering. The investigation that began with my stolen EmotiLink technology had unraveled a sophisticated criminal network that had been operating for over a decade. Carla hadn't just been running her own theft operation. She had been part of a larger conspiracy that targeted inventors, startups, and small technology companies across multiple industries. The criminals had developed systematic methods for identifying valuable intellectual property, infiltrating organizations to steal it, and then legitimizing the stolen technology through shell companies and fraudulent business operations. Rachel explained that my willingness to pursue federal charges against my own sister had provided the breakthrough that law enforcement needed to penetrate this criminal network. Most victims of intellectual property theft never report the crimes, either because they don't recognize what happened to them or because they're intimidated by the complexity and cost of legal action. My case had demonstrated that sophisticated theft operations could be successfully prosecuted, encouraging dozens of other victims to come forward with their own evidence. The ripple effects of these prosecutions were transforming how the technology industry approached intellectual property protection. Major venture capital firms had implemented new due diligence procedures to verify the authenticity of technologies they were considering for investment. Universities had strengthened their protocols for protecting student research. Government agencies had allocated additional resources to investigating and prosecuting technology crimes. But Rachel's call also contained a personal revelation that explained some aspects of Carla's behavior that had never made complete sense to me. The federal investigation had uncovered evidence that Carla herself had initially been a victim of the criminal network before becoming one of its most effective operators. She had been recruited during her early career by criminals who had stolen one of her legitimate marketing innovations, and they had offered her a choice between pursuing expensive legal action or joining their operation as a recruitment specialist. The psychological profile that emerged from this investigation was complex and disturbing. Carla had rationalized her transformation from victim to perpetrator by convincing herself that intellectual property theft was a natural part of business competition, that inventors who failed to protect their work deserved to lose it, and that family relationships provided both opportunity and justification for taking what she needed to succeed. Her manipulation of me hadn't been purely opportunistic. It had been part of a systematic desensitization process that allowed her to commit increasingly serious crimes while maintaining her self-image as a successful entrepreneur. This revelation didn't excuse Carla's crimes or diminish the harm she had caused to me and dozens of other victims, but it did provide context for understanding how someone could develop the psychological framework necessary to systematically steal from family members while appearing to offer support and guidance. The criminal network had essentially created a system for turning victims into perpetrators, ensuring a steady supply of new criminals who were motivated by personal experience with theft and manipulation. Rachel also informed me that the federal investigation had uncovered evidence of additional crimes that Carla had committed against me beyond the technology theft I had originally discovered. The surveillance operation that had monitored my development work had also included monitoring of my personal communications, my financial records, and my professional relationships. She had been conducting comprehensive intelligence gathering that extended far beyond what was necessary for stealing my algorithms. The most disturbing discovery was that Carla had been actively sabotaging my job applications during the period when I was struggling to find employment after graduation. She had used her professional network to spread negative information about my reliability and technical capabilities, ensuring that I would remain financially vulnerable and dependent on family support. My difficulty finding work hadn't been due to market conditions or my own limitations. It had been the result of a systematic campaign to undermine my professional prospects. This sabotage had served multiple purposes in Carla's overall strategy. Keeping me unemployed and financially stressed had made me more grateful for her support and less likely to question her motives when she showed interest in my research. It had also isolated me from professional networks that might have provided guidance about protecting my intellectual property or resources for pursuing legal action when theft occurred. The federal investigators had also discovered that Carla had been documenting my psychological responses to her manipulation, apparently as part of developing more effective techniques for targeting other victims. She had kept detailed notes about which emotional appeals were most effective in gaining access to my work, which types of questions extracted the most valuable information, and which manipulation strategies were most successful in preventing me from recognizing what was happening. These files revealed that the sisterly concern she had expressed about my mental health struggles wasn't genuine worry. It was strategic manipulation designed to position me as someone whose perceptions couldn't be trusted. By consistently framing my anxiety and career uncertainty as evidence of instability, she had been laying groundwork to discredit any future claims I might make about theft or fraud. But the most chilling aspect of these psychological profiles was that they had been shared with other members of the criminal network as training materials for targeting similar victims. My personal vulnerabilities, my family relationships, and my responses to manipulation had been studied and systematized to help other criminals identify and exploit inventors with similar characteristics. Learning about this additional layer of violation was initially devastating, but it also provided a strange sense of vindication. The elaborate nature of the criminal operation confirmed that my victimization hadn't been the result of poor judgment or preventable mistakes on my part. I had been targeted by sophisticated criminals who had developed their methods through years of practice and systematic study of how to exploit human psychology and family relationships. Rachel explained that this new evidence was being used to pursue additional charges against Carla and other network members, including violations of privacy laws, identity theft, and conspiracy charges that carried substantial additional penalties. The comprehensive nature of their criminal activities meant that many of them would face decades in prison rather than the shorter sentences that might have been imposed for simple intellectual property theft. More importantly for my own recovery process, the federal investigation had completely validated my decision to pursue criminal charges despite family pressure and social expectations. The evidence showed that Carla's crimes against me were part of a much larger pattern of victimization that had harmed hundreds of inventors and entrepreneurs. By refusing to accept my family's narrative that I should just move on, I had helped expose and disrupt criminal operations that were continuing to harm other people. The conversation with Rachel also provided information about the current status of other victims who had been targeted by the criminal network. Many of them had experienced psychological impacts similar to what I had endured, including self-doubt, social isolation, and difficulty trusting their own perceptions about what had happened to them. The federal investigation had connected these victims with resources for recovery and had helped many of them pursue civil litigation to recover damages. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome of the expanded investigation was the development of new legal frameworks for protecting inventors and entrepreneurs from sophisticated theft operations. Congress had passed legislation that strengthened intellectual property protections, increased penalties for technology crimes, and provided resources for victims to pursue legal action. These changes would help ensure that future victims would have better tools for fighting back against criminals. The impact on my own business had been overwhelmingly positive. The publicity surrounding the federal investigation had established me as a recognized expert on technology, crime prevention, and intellectual property protection. My speaking engagements at industry conferences and law enforcement training programs had generated consulting opportunities that complemented my core business of developing mental health technology. More importantly, the validation provided by the federal investigation had completely transformed my relationship with innovation and entrepreneurship. The self-doubt that had been instilled by months of gaslighting and manipulation had been replaced by confidence in my technical abilities and my judgment about business opportunities. I was no longer the tentative graduate who had been afraid to file patents. I was an established entrepreneur who understood both the opportunities and the risks of bringing new technology to market. The success of my legitimate EmotiLink platform had exceeded every metric we had projected during the initial business planning process. We were serving over 100,000 active users, had partnerships with major healthcare systems, and were generating revenue that supported a team of 40 employees. The technology that Carla had stolen and tried to claim as her own innovation was now helping people access mental health support in ways that were measurably improving their quality of life. But the business success was accompanied by a deeper sense of purpose that had emerged from surviving and overcoming sophisticated criminal victimization. Every user who found value in our platform, every partnership that expanded access to mental health resources, and every innovation that improved therapeutic outcomes represented a victory over the criminals who had tried to steal and suppress this technology. The advocacy work that had grown out of my experience had also evolved into a more systematic effort to support other victims of intellectual property theft. I had established a foundation that provided legal assistance, technical expertise, and emotional support for inventors and entrepreneurs who had been targeted by criminal organizations. The foundation's work was funded by a portion of the restitution payments from Carla's conviction and by donations from technology companies that wanted to support intellectual property protection efforts. One of the most rewarding aspects of this advocacy work was mentoring young inventors who were developing breakthrough technologies. Many of them were brilliant researchers who lacked business experience and were vulnerable to the same types of manipulation that had been used against me. By sharing my story and providing practical guidance about protecting intellectual property, I was helping ensure that their innovations would benefit them rather than being stolen by criminals. The mentoring relationships also provided opportunities to identify and report potential intellectual property theft before it could cause serious harm to victims. Several times over the past 3 years, inventors had approached me with concerns about business relationships that seemed suspicious, and in multiple cases, we had uncovered theft attempts that were stopped before significant damage occurred. Working with law enforcement agencies had also become a regular part of my professional activities. Federal prosecutors frequently consulted with me about intellectual property cases, seeking insights about criminal methodologies and victim experiences that could strengthen their prosecutions. This collaboration had led to more effective investigations and higher conviction rates for technology crimes. But perhaps the most personally meaningful aspect of my recovery was the restoration of family relationships that had been damaged by Carla's manipulation and my decision to pursue criminal charges. My parents had undergone extensive therapy to understand how they had been deceived and to develop healthier patterns for supporting their children. They had learned to recognize manipulation tactics and to ask critical questions when presented with information that seemed too convenient or self-serving. The process of rebuilding trust with my parents had been gradual and sometimes difficult, but it had ultimately resulted in relationships that were more honest and supportive than what had existed before Carla's crimes. They had learned to value truth over family harmony, to support victims rather than enabling criminals, and to recognize that genuine love sometimes requires confronting uncomfortable realities about people we care about. My father had become particularly engaged in understanding the technical aspects of the crimes that had been committed against me. He had educated himself about intellectual property law, cybersecurity, and criminal investigation methods, transforming himself from someone who had dismissed my concerns to someone who could provide informed support for my advocacy work. My mother had focused more on the psychological aspects of recovery and had become an advocate for family therapy resources that could help other families navigate similar crises. She had written articles for parenting magazines about recognizing manipulation within families and had spoken at conferences for families affected by white-collar crime. The relationship with extended family members had been more complicated to repair, with some relatives never fully accepting the extent of Carla's criminal activities. But the federal investigation had provided such comprehensive documentation of her crimes that even the most skeptical family members could no longer deny what had happened. Some relationships remained strained, but the ones that survived were based on acknowledgement of truth rather than maintenance of comfortable illusions. 3 years after receiving that call from Rachel Morrison, I was invited to speak at the graduation ceremony for my alma mater's computer science program. Standing at the podium where I had once been too intimidated to ask questions during lectures, I addressed an audience of new graduates who were about to enter the technology industry with their own innovations and aspirations. My speech focused on the importance of protecting intellectual property, recognizing manipulation tactics, and having the courage to fight for what belongs to you. But I also emphasized that the greatest protection against criminals is building authentic relationships with people who value truth over convenience, who support victims rather than enabling perpetrators, and who understand that real success is based on genuine innovation rather than sophisticated theft. The questions from students after my speech revealed that many of them had already encountered suspicious business proposals or relationships that seemed designed to gain access to their research rather than to provide legitimate collaboration opportunities. The awareness created by publicizing cases like mine was helping young inventors recognize and avoid potential theft before it could occur. But the most meaningful moment of the graduation ceremony came when Professor Martinez introduced me as a Stanford alumna who exemplifies the courage and persistence that our graduates will need to protect their innovations and build ethical businesses in an increasingly complex technological landscape. The recognition from my former professor, who had unknowingly celebrated my stolen work 3 years earlier, represented a complete restoration of my professional reputation. After the ceremony, several graduates approached me with questions about starting their own companies, protecting their research, and navigating the business aspects of technology development. These conversations reminded me of my own uncertainty and vulnerability during my post-graduation period, but they also highlighted how much my perspective had changed through surviving and overcoming criminal victimization. The young woman who had been afraid to file patents had become someone who could guide others through the complexities of intellectual property protection. The sister who had trusted too easily had become someone who could teach others to recognize manipulation tactics. The victim who had questioned her own sanity had become someone who could provide validation and support for others facing similar challenges. Looking back on the entire experience, from discovering MindFlow on TechCrunch to speaking at Stanford's graduation ceremony, I realized that Carla's greatest miscalculation hadn't been underestimating my evidence or my legal resources. Her greatest miscalculation had been underestimating what I would become through the process of fighting for justice. She had assumed that I would remain the passive, people-pleasing sister who would eventually accept whatever narrative was most convenient for family harmony. Instead, the experience of being systematically victimized and then successfully prosecuting sophisticated criminals had transformed me into someone who understood that the most important battles are often the ones where you're fighting not just for what you've lost, but for who you have the potential to become. The theft of my technology had been devastating, but recovering from that theft had revealed capabilities and strengths that I never would have discovered otherwise. Today, when young inventors ask me whether pursuing justice against family members or trusted associates is worth the personal cost, I tell them that the question isn't whether it's worth it to fight for what belongs to you. The question is whether it's worth it to become the kind of person who won't tolerate being victimized, who can help others avoid similar harm, and who can build something meaningful on a foundation of truth rather than theft. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can recover isn't what was stolen from you. Sometimes it's the person you become through the process of refusing to let criminals define your story. That transformation is worth more than any technology, any business success, or any family relationship that requires you to pretend that crimes didn't happen. The girl who had been too scared to protect her intellectual property had become the woman who helped dismantle a criminal network. The sister who had accepted manipulation as family support had become the entrepreneur who taught others to recognize and resist exploitation. The victim who had almost accepted someone else's version of reality had become the advocate who helped others reclaim their truth. And that transformation, more than any legal victory or business achievement, was the real measure of how completely I had overcome what Carla and her criminal associates had tried to do to me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.